why did you decide this idea? So you guys pivoted many times and then, okay, this is
Before this pivot, we worked on this marketplace.
marketplace.
We worked on a home services marketplace. It's very hard. Home services is very hard. And we worked on a home services marketplace to help consumers find, hire, manage service professionals. So kind of the other side. And when we were doing that, we kept on getting like home service professionals that we were working with. We worked with a couple dozen, like just calling us, texting us, and being like, hey, look, I like what you're doing, which is like packaging up demand. But what I really need help with is like just managing my current leads.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So actually, I found this entrepreneur from 10 days ago, right?
Yeah. I think it's been about just a week and a half. Very, very recent.
Do you remember the event was?
Yeah, it was at Frontier Tower, actually this building. So our team just moved here, and we met Kari at one of the events. Yeah, we did. We just moved in, so everything's super fresh. We're on the 16th floor right now. It's like a general space, completely empty, but great for filming today.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Kevin, tell us about yourself. What do you do in San Francisco?
So today we're building Breezy. We're building Breezy. You can search Breezy AI, and it's AI employees for solo service professionals. So we want to be the first employee and the last employee that anybody who runs a service business will need to hire for. And we're starting with the front desk. So you can kind of think of it as like an AI phone that can help you manage your customer conversations and your relationships via phone calls and text messages. But we're working on supporting our customers through the entire business operating lifecycle, from front office all the way to back office.
Okay, so I come from Tokyo and I interviewed some founders and they are building a kind of AI agent for specific, like to support legal team in the corporate, to support recruiting department in the corporate. But your idea is so kind of a multitask?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we see it is that we are building vertically, but we're building vertically for the job to be done. So in our case, the job to be done is like, how do you operate your phone? And for our ICP, which is like, solo individual, like individual service businesses, what we realized that like a lot of their jobs actually converge with what they need to do when answering the phone. So for example, like scheduling an appointment, making sure people show up, qualifying their customers, answering questions. And the way that we see it is that like when you're selling work versus selling like a workflow, one of the big things that we need to focus on is like, how do you be the best work persona? How do you be the best front desk persona? So another way to think about this is like a great receptionist for a plumbing company is also going to be a great receptionist for a truck driver. And the reason why is because for them, like what makes a great receptionist a great receptionist? It's actually all of the kind of work and connective tissue around the work that they do that's important. So for example, like how do you get up to speed quickly? How do you take feedback about what's going on the ground? How do you like take the learnings from like the customers that you have and the conversations that you have and feed it back into insights for the business? So for us, I think that's kind of like the main focus is like we're leaning on the foundational models, hoping that they're going to get better, and then building all of the kind of the workflows and connective tissue around like how do you be the best receptionist for an individual.
I see. So why did you decide this idea? So you guys pivoted many times and then, okay, this is.
Yeah. So this confluence of two things. The first thing is before this pivot, we worked on this marketplace. We worked on a home services marketplace. It's very hard. Home services is very hard. And we worked on a home services marketplace to help consumers find, hire, manage service professionals. So kind of the other side. And when we were doing that, we kept on getting like home service professionals that we were working with. We worked with a couple dozen, like just calling us, texting us, and being like, hey, look, I like what you're doing, which is like packaging up demand, but what I really need help with is like just managing my current leads. It's like you're bringing additional leads, which is nice, but really the current leads is like my biggest challenge. So for them, we were like, oh, like what does that mean? They're like, oh, I do business over the phone. So they were like, can you help me pick up my phone? I'm like, oh, interesting. We can help you pick up the phone. And we sort of kind of, discovered two different personas here. One was like, more mid-market and up-market, where it's like you have a team, you have like many people in the field. And at that point, you already have someone answering the phone today.
I see.
But what was interesting for us was that like there's also this category of solo professional, they've never been in the market. It never even crossed their mind to hire a human because humans are so expensive. So for them, they rely on voicemail. They kind of do everything themselves. And that was kind of like our moment where we're like, hey, look, AI is only gonna get better, but today it's still not human quality, and we don't want to pretend it's human quality. But what we know is that like it's already 10x better than voicemail. So that was sort of our wedge. But the thing that got us like super excited was that, beyond the wedge, like you're talking to these solo pros and you're like, hey, like what else do you need help with? And they start describing like, like CRM without CRM, because you realize that they never needed a way to like collaborate with a team if they never had a team. So for us, like we're kind of doing two things. One is like we're building the first teammate that they're having, but we're also building like kind of the system of record, the rails for collaboration of like how do you interact with that teammate and kind of make the most out of that. And we made our pivot like July 2024, like July last year. Got to our first 100 customers like November. Product itself at first was like just really scrappy. It was like literally a phone number that someone can call, and then we'll send a text message summary after the call. But we kind of saw like the opportunity to like go much deeper, much broader with our customers, and that gave us the conviction to go and raise our seed round. So we raised $3 million in November last year, and now we're just kind of like doubling down and focusing on that vision.
You mentioned job to be done.
Like for the past 7 years, before finding this company, I've been a product manager for Lime and then at Kickoff. So I think this is like one of the frameworks that like really helps kind of ground you in like what is it that like this product is actually trying to do. And I think if you can align yourself as a product builder with the eventual end outcomes that your customers are looking for, the job that they're trying to get done, it becomes a lot easier to prioritize. It becomes a lot easier to like just understand like what needs to be done on a day-to-day. Yeah, I mean, we got lucky because we were working on a marketplace already. So we already were working with dozens of pros, and a lot of them were raising their hands. They were like, hey, I don't really like this marketplace, but look, I need help with customer qualification. Like I need help with like answering the phone. And then we just texted them back, gave them a few calls, and we're like, oh, like what does that actually look like? And then over the course of 2 weeks, we were able to get our first version out. They didn't have any UI or UX or anything. It was just literally like a phone number. But that's how we got our first like customer, and then first handful of customers actually was that way.
I see. So the initial customers really want to encourage your product, right? So becoming your fan, and also as well your company can do like usability testing and also user interview, right?
Yeah. Actually, like when I think of our customers too, like this is the other thing that helped us inform our pivot, was that you really gotta love like your customer and who you're serving, and like you got like they have to energize you every morning. And the thing that like got like me and the team excited was that for a business owner, there's like nothing more important about what they do than the business that they're running. So for them, it's like their business is their life. And especially for like solo pros, like oftentimes, voice AI today, there's a lot of voice AI, but a lot of folks are going after like mid-market and enterprise. And the big reasons is that like they have a lot of willingness to pay. But the thing is like, that means like the individual solo operators, they're the ones being left behind, right? They're the ones that are gonna get the technology last. So we were like, hey, these folks, they're so passionate. Like, what can we do to help them get access to that technology? And there's something that like kind of ties back to one of my like formational like memories as well. Like in high school, the first dollar I made, this was sophomore year of high school. It was like building websites for.
You did?
I did, yeah. I built some websites for local businesses.
Really?
Yeah.
How old were you?
Sophomore year, I don't know, like 15, 14 maybe. Yeah.
You are so entrepreneurial.
Yeah, it was it was it was a whole lot of fun, but even then like I kind of realized that like, you know, the delta is high in like the access that folks have to like cool tech. And the customer you're serving, like the amount of passion they have for what they're doing, like they live and breathe that stuff. There's almost no one else better that you could be serving. I moved to San Francisco. It's been 7 years now for me. So I grew up in Canada, went to Waterloo, and kind of did the, learn to be a computer scientist, and worked on a lot of engineering teams back in college. And then what brought me to San Francisco was after I finished college, I wanted to join an earlier stage team. So I joined Lime as a product manager on their marketplace team. So we've worked on a lot of the projects around like how do you place scooters in the city. So for example, every morning you're deploying all these scooters. What's the best placement for them to meet demand? And we worked on a lot of the pricing and placement initiatives as well. So
Placement means?
placement means like where do you deploy the scooters, and then pricing. Yeah.
Okay, so at the time, you had explored the city and to check the place.
Yeah. So it started off as like just a bunch of human operators deciding where they wanted to place the scooters. And then we were like, oh, I think we could probably make better decisions with data. So then what we started doing was looking at demand and how that tracked to trips depending on where it was deployed. And then we used that as actually the backbone for deployments. And then we also worked on a lot of the pricing projects as well. So like the first thing that we did was build one of the first scooter subscription products, Lime Pass. Lime Pass, yeah. It was like a weekly subscription to make it more affordable for a daily rider to ride their scooters. And so that's where I came to San Francisco full time. And then through Lime, I got recruited to join one of my managers who started a new fintech company called Kickoff.
So your manager means from Lime?
Yeah.
Wow, okay, so your manager really like you. Oh, Kevin, you should join my company like that.
Yeah. So I joined as their second employee and the first product manager at this. It was a wild journey because for me, I was like, oh, like it's cool to see like a company scale from like Series A to Series D. But I want to do something earlier stage. That's always been kind of like something I wanted to do and something I wanted to learn. So I joined Kickoff as their second employee, founding PM. They recruited me over, and then we also brought Saul, who's my now co-founder, over from Lime as well. He became the second engineer at that company, and eventually became the first engineering manager. So together we worked on a lot of the core product and engineering features together at Kickoff, and this was like over 3 years, and we saw that grow from like 0 to 100 million plus customers, and
Really?
yeah, and tens of millions in revenue during that time.
Amazing. So you are talking about your previous startup, right? What do you think? Just in 3 years, Kickoff could grow so like speedy.
I think this is like kind of the crux of every startup, which is like how do you find an underserved population? For Kickoff, what they found was that like subprime credit builders in America were really struggling. For them, they had big dreams. They wanted to live the American dream, right? They wanted to like own a car, own a house, and live a good life. But the challenge was that like they've made a lot of mistakes in the past, and a lot of those mistakes, especially in credit, stopped them from being able to get access to future credit. So what the company did is that we found a way to help those customers get access to credit products that will help them build and kind of like retrain them in the credit system, which then gave them more access later on to additional products once they've kind of experienced it for the first time and are back on the right track. This was 2023. Saul and I, we left to explore the -1 to 0. And what we were excited about, we were like, oh, if AI is going to be as big as the internet, which by the way, I think now it's going to be bigger than the internet. But at the time we were like, oh, if there's like a 10% chance that this is going to be bigger than the internet, we will regret not giving this a shot. and doing our own exploration and starting a company. So we joined. We were lucky enough to join South Park Commons Founder Fellowship. It's like an accelerator. Yeah, it's both a fund and a community for some of the best like -1 to 0 entrepreneurs, founders, technologists to explore and to figure out what their next step is in life. Sometimes that means like, oh, how do you explore the -1 to 0? And for some folks, that means building a company. For other folks, we've had previous alumni from South Park Commons do different things in the city. For example, someone has become like a board member in San Francisco now in politics.
Okay, so how was the process to join this South Park Common? And also, is this not the accelerator program? What do you think?
Yeah, so they call it the anti-incubator, but it is like an accelerator program for folks that are kind of exploring the -1 to 0. And
so negative is like minus 0.
Yeah.
Okay, like idea base.
Yeah, so for us, like we went through, I think 6 or 7 pivots during our time in that program. But what they do is that they invest in kind of exceptional founders and follow you through that journey. So they put money in even without an idea at the time. And a lot of our batchmates now have all gone on and raised subsequent, seed funding rounds to double down on what's working today.
Okay, so Kevin, so you and your co-founder Sol joined the cohort, and at the time, how many founders or startups in the same cohort?
Yeah, for us, there was our cohort fall 2023 in. Fall 2023, there was 13 teams in our cohort. 13. There were 13 teams, I think 26 individuals. So about, two members per team. They also have a community as well. So the community is a couple hundred strong. And yeah, I think, we were there for over a year and a half until we raised our seed in November.
This is amazing. So I have tons of questions. So join the cohort, and then duration was like 6 weeks or?
Yeah. So they provide support for as long as you need it to get to the next stage. And for the different founder fellows in our cohort, we saw some folks that raised their seed funding like still during the cohort. So and we've also had folks like us where it took over a year after the cohort finished, to land on the idea and have enough conviction to get to the next stage.
And the most wonderful things is after cohort, you guys got to fundraise from the South Park Common, right? Yeah. Did you do some demo day?
So they have an event called Demo Fair, and then the way that they work is that the Demo Fair is very there's no slides. It's entirely based off of what is the working product. We did the demo fair. This was May 2024, on a previous idea we had actually. It was a pre-pivot from what we're working on today. But that journey was also interesting because we explored a bunch of ideas, and then by May we did the demo fair, and then what we realized was that there was a problem amongst a different segment of customers that was kind of way more compelling, and that led to what Breezy was today.
My imagination is like a cohort, and you said 6 times or 7 times pivoted, right? So how did you decide to pivot? Maybe the cohort, kind of VC or teachers, they suggested you, hey, Kevin, it's a great idea, but maybe it's not making money. You guys had better to pivot or change.
I think there's 2 things that I really enjoyed during my time at SPC. One was there was kind of no set demo days or no set demo timelines. So what that meant was that they really gave us the space to develop conviction. And the other thing was they were very celebratory upon pivots. It was not seen as a failure. It was seen as great. You got to kill the good ideas so that you can focus on the great. And that gave us a lot of, I think, energy and just like confidence that like, hey, maybe what we're working on right now isn't the thing we want to work on for the next 5 to 10 years of our lives. So they gave us that space to do that. I think the other thing with the cohort that I really felt was quite interesting was that the 13 companies we were with, they're all in different stages and working on kind of different things, everything from B2B, B2C, healthcare to SaaS to AI agents. And what's kind of cool is that like as you're sort of growing up together, you get to see what the most important what the most pressing questions are for each kind of business. So you get to like live vicariously through like the learnings of like other founders as you progress week over week.
I see. This is good. Definitely, you feel you guys could get strong bond with your other founders, right? Strong connection.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, some of those folks are great friends today. We regularly catch up and grab drinks and just kind of support each other as we're going through the founder journey.
This is a real community.
Oh, 100%.
Amazing. See, thank you. Okay, so Kevin, last 2 questions. One. Do you have any pain point recently? Maybe I could help you, or our audience also could help you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, like one of the big things right now is, as you can imagine, like our customer base, a lot of them haven't written a prompt before. They're very non-technical.
Okay, so you are kind of customers, like you said, a mama papa shop, papa mama shop.
Yes. Mom and pop shops, mom and pop shops, or like just like solo operations, just like one person operating the business.
Sometimes so grandma or grandpa.
Oh yeah. We have a wide range, but a lot of folks not very technical, and I think one of the big challenges that like with building AI agents is like how do you make this agent so easy to set up, such that anyone can do it. And I think that's like going to be the challenge of our time, which is like you have all these layers of abstraction starting from the foundational models, but it's like how do you just like at the end of the day just make it so simple that they can get started as easy as it would be with training a human. So for us, I think that's like a big UX challenge. It's going to be like an evergreen challenge that we have. So as a part of that, we're looking for strong design engineers and kind of bringing on the right design talent to help us abstract away the complexity and really make it simple and focus on helping our customers accomplish their jobs to be done. And I think the other thing is I think that's the biggest challenge, is making this thing super simple. The other thing is how do we take this product and make sure it can cover the entire life cycle. So the way I see it is Shopify didn't win because they were a website builder. Yeah. They won because they can help you from beginning to end of selling a product. Yeah. The entire life cycle, everything, billing, payments, invoicing, delivery. So for us, I mean, voice is just an interface. It's just like a website. It's like your top of funnel. Yeah. How do we now help your business go from that beginning all the way through the end of every job, of every customer, closing every loop that we can? So I think that that's going to take just a lot of building. So we built a way to, do SMS, take notes about customers, take notes about, what's going on in your conversations. Realize that at Tide, why are people calling in? Because they want to get something scheduled. So we built a native calendar integration. A lot of our customers today are like, okay, great. Now how can you help me with invoicing and payments? That's the stuff that's coming in as part of the next phase. But yeah, the goal is everything from call to job completion is something that we'll be able to handle.
I see. I would love to try.
Yeah, you can check it out. It's you can Google Breezy AI.
Breezy AI.
Yeah, and that should be the first result.
Thank you so much. Last question, Kevin. Tell us about your milestone in this 1 year.
Yeah, this 1 year, I think the biggest thing is how can we create the simplest product. And the way we see the company is that there's a couple phases. The first is how can we be your assistant behind the phone, kind of like be your AI phone, not just voicemail, but like, handle everything behind the phone. And I think this year is like, we're gonna be regressive. It's gonna like, okay, how can you run a business off of Breezy? And that's really the big product goal. It's like, how do we help our customers really be successful so that they don't need to hire anybody, they don't need other software. They just have their team ready to go. Primarily, it's in the United States and Canada for now, for account creation.
And also, if you want to invest him or want to talk with Kevin, please reach out Kevin's LinkedIn.
Yeah, you can check me out on LinkedIn, Kevin Shi, San Francisco.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Kevin. 1. Sometimes the wrong idea leads to the right one. We thought we were building a marketplace, but our customers need something else entirely. Kevin's pivot to Breezy didn't come from brainstorming. It came from listening. While working a home service marketplace, solo professionals kept telling him, "Your leads are nice, but I need help managing the ones I already have." That pain point, answering a call and managing a lead, became the foundation of Breezy AI. Takeaway: don't fear pivot. Your customers might be handling your next big idea. 2. Build for unsolved, not the obvious. Big companies have team, solo pros don't. That's who we are building for. While many AI companies chase enterprise clients, Kevin focused on solo operators, the ones nobody else is helping. Breezy acts as their first teammate, handling phone calls, scheduling, and admin works, so they can focus on what they do best. Takeaway: tech shouldn't just scale corporations, it should empower individuals. 3. South Park comments gave space to think deeply. They celebrated pivots. That made all the difference. South Park comments didn't pressure Kevin to perform. They gave him time and funding to explore. He pivoted 6 to 7 times, learned from every step, and found conviction in the idea that became Breezy. That freedom shaped the company's thoughtful, user-centered DNA. Takeaway: real innovation needs time, trust, and room to explore. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. Okay, thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。